when the Spirit touches man's heart and brow with thoughts that are lofty, bold, serene, so that the clear eyes he will face the world as a free man may. When then the Spirit gives birth to action, by which alone we stand or fall, when from the sane and resolute action rises the work that gives a man's life, content and meaning, then would that man, lonely and actively working, know of the Spirit that grasps and befriends him, like waters clear and refreshing, where the Spirit is cleansed from the dust and cooled from the heat that oppressed him, steeling himself in the hour of fatigue, like a fortress to which, for confusion and danger, the Spirit returns, wherein he finds refuge and comfort and strengthening as a friend to a friend.
At midday on Monday, April 5th, Bonhoeffer tried to ring up his sister, Christine von Danye, at her Sacro house. But his call was answered by an unknown man's voice. He at once thought, "The house is being searched." Without disturbing his parents, he went across to his sister Ursula Schlager in the next-door house and got her to give him a good meal, after which he went up to his attic to check the contents of his desk once more. Then he waited next door with the Schlagers. About 4 o'clock, his father came across. "There are 2 men wanting to speak to you upstairs in your room." Shortly afterwards, Judge Advocate Roeder and the Gestapo official drove off with him. The night of April 6th was cold in the reception cell at Tegel. Bonhoeffer could not bring himself to use the blankets of the plank bed, as he could not stand the stench that rose from them. There was someone crying loudly in the next cell. In the morning, dry bread was thrown through a crack in the door. The staff had been instructed not to speak to the new arrival. The warder called him a blackguard. Bonhoeffer was then taken to the section where the solitary confinement cells were, where those condemned to death were held, bound hand and foot. A few days later, he too was handcuffed when he was taken to town for his first interrogation at the Reich War Court. As a member of the Abwehr, he came under the jurisdiction of a military court, but Colonel Roeder, who conducted the hearing, always had beside him officials from the Reich Security Head Office.
Strangely enough, the discomforts that one generally associates with prison life, the physical hardships, hardly bother me at all. One can even have enough to eat in the morning with dry bread. I get a variety of extras too. The hard prison bed does not worry me a bit, and one can get plenty of sleep between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. I've been particularly surprised that I have hardly felt any need at all for cigarettes since I came here. But I think that in all of this, the psychic factor has played the larger part. A violent mental upheaval such as is produced by a sudden arrest brings with it the need to take one's mental bearings and to come to terms with an entirely new situation. All of this means that physical things take a back seat and lose their importance. And it is something that I find to be a real enrichment of my experience. The only thing that bothers me, or would bother me, is the thought that you are being tormented by my anxiety about me, and are not sleeping or eating properly.
The first thing he did was to set himself a strict regime of his own from which he did not depart. Physical exercise, his long accustomed meditation, the learning by heart and reading of scriptures after he was given back his Bible on the 3rd day.
One of my predecessors here has scribbled over the cell door, "In 100 years it'll all be over." That was his way of trying to counter the feeling that life spent here is a blank. But there is a great deal that might be said about that, and I should like to talk it over with Father. "My time is in your hands," is the Bible's answer. But in the Bible there is also the question that threatens to dominate everything here. How long, O Lord? A few times in my life I have come to know what homesick means. There is nothing more painful, and during these months in prison I have sometimes been terribly homesick.
Thus the idea of suicide came to him in 2 forms. in the shape of his concern for those continuing the struggle and because of his temptation for depression. The former could be shaken off as soon as he had a reasonable prospect of averting the attention of his persecutors and of managing to hold out.
Dissatisfaction, tension, impatience, longing, boredom, sick, profoundly alone, indifference, urging to do something, change, novelty, being blunted, tiredness, sleep, order, fantasy, disorientation of past and future, suicide. Not because of conscience of guilt, but because basically I'm already dead. Is the memory better for joyful impressions? Why is that? A past grief stands under the sign of being overcome. Only griefs that have not been overcome, unforgiven sin, are always fresh and tormenting to the memory, overcoming in prayer.
The fact that he very quickly overcame the later almost surprised him, but he was helped by the need to concentrate as much as possible on the tactics of the interrogation. Bonhoeffer's period at Tegel was taken up with his stubborn and successful efforts to conceal or disguise the true facts. His family and friends assisted him in weaving a complex net of camouflage. Sometimes the threads became tangled, but on the whole, it held.
What then is joy? What then is sorrow? Time alone can decide between them, when the immediate, poignant happening lengthens out to continuous wearisome suffering, when the labored, creeping moments of daylight slowly uncover the fullness of our disaster, sorrow's unmistakable features.
Bonhoeffer used his inexperience as a weapon of defense. In contrast to the fears of many of those involved, he was not so ignorant that he made any disastrous mistakes.
I am the last person to deny that I might have made mistakes in work so strange, so new, and so complicated as that of the Advair. I often find it hard to follow the speed of your questions, probably because I'm not used to them.
Then there began the arranged passing of information from prison to prison through his family and friends. One way in which it was done was by making particular marks on the pages of the reading matter that he was allowed to receive as a prisoner held for interrogation. For instance, Bonhoeffer asked for a volume to be sent him from home. If the owner's name, D. Bonhoeffer, was underlined in the book, that meant it contained a message. The message was entered by putting a faint pencil mark under a letter every 10 pages, starting from the back. The letters marked in this way made up for the instance the sentence, O now officially acknowledges the Rome coding card, so that Bonhoeffer could now argue with confidence about the business of the slips of paper, if necessary. He replied in a similar way when he gave back the book. Thus he once marked the message, I'm not certain that the letter with Hahn's correction has been found, but think so. This referred to the affair of being exempted from military service, especially Bonhoeffer's letter of complaint to the Gestapo of September 1940. Bonhoeffer was initially charged with 4 separate charges: his exemption as a means of escaping observation by the Gestapo to continue his church work, his involvement in Operation 7, his journeys which were suspected to have nothing to do with military intelligence, and his flagrant exemption from military service of officials of the confessing church.
Although it may sound paradoxical, I was really glad yesterday when at last permission for a lawyer and then the warrant for my arrest came. So it seems that the apparently purposeless waiting will soon be over. At the same time, being in custody for so long has brought me experiences that I shall never forget. Much as I long to be out of here, I don't believe a single day has been wasted. What will come of my time here, it's still too early to say, but something will come of it.
All the charges against Bonhoeffer were dropped except for one. Now the only charge left was that placing Bonhoeffer on the reserve list had been an anti-military act.
Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I know of myself? Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others, and before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. I often wonder who I really am. The man who goes on squirming under these ghastly experiences in wretchedness that cries to heaven, or the man who scourges himself and pretends to others and even to himself that he is placid, cheerful, composed, and in control of himself, and allows people to admire him for it. What does one's attitude mean anyway? In short, I know less than ever about myself, and am no longer attaching any importance to it. I've had more than enough psychology, and I'm less and less inclined to analyze the state of my soul.
In the course of time, Tegel had provided Bonhoeffer with a mobility that one does not expect from the prisons of the Third Reich, and that the majority of Hitler's victims did not enjoy. This was due partly to the nature of a military prison, but partly also to Bonhoeffer's way of treating his warders. Among the older staff of Tegel prison, Bonhoeffer came to know a number of warders who were strongly opposed to the regime. Others proved willing and helpful when the politicals or their highly placed relations showed them kindnesses or gave them gifts. Also, Bonhoeffer's energetic protests against the customary rough behavior of the warders were successful, and they desisted. The staff consisted of long-service privates and corporals, hard-boiled men unfit for fighting in the field.
2 or 3 times here I have given people a quite colossal dressing down for indulging in the only slightest rudeness, and they were so disconcerted that they have behaved very correctly since then. I thoroughly enjoy this sort of thing, but I know it is really an impossible oversensitiveness that I can hardly get rid of. It makes me furious to see quite defenseless people being unjustly shouted at and insulted. These petty tormentors who can rage like that, and whom one finds everywhere, get me worked up for hours on end.
To these men, Bonhoeffer appeared an extraordinarily interesting prisoner. The pastor, who is admitted under the greatest secrecy, then turns out to be the nephew of the city commandant, and is soon taken for walks by the prison commandant personally. Thus, this prisoner gradually became an influential inmate of the house. Throughout Bonhoeffer's stay at Tegel, Berlin received frequent air raids. During one such air raid, Bonhoeffer proved himself and was later made medical orderly for his section.
My cell is high up, and the window is quite wide open during alerts, so one has a very clear view of the ghastly firework display on the south side of the city. And without the least feeling of anxiety for myself, I do feel most strongly at such times how utterly absurd it is for me to keep waiting here doing nothing.
Due to the concern caused by the frequent air raids, Bonhoeffer was later moved to the first floor of the prison.
It really is a strange feeling to see the Christmas trees, the flares coming down right over our heads. The shouting and screaming of the prisoners in their cells was terrible. We had no dead, only injured, and we finished bandaging them by 1 o'clock. After that, I was able to drop off at once into a sound sleep. People here talk quite openly about how frightened they were. The fact that the horrors of war are now coming home to us with such force will no doubt, if we survive, provide us with the necessary basis for making it possible to reconstruct life of the nations both spiritually and materially on Christian principles. So we must try to keep these experiences in our minds, use them in our work, make them bear fruit, and not just shake them off. Never have we been so plainly conscious of the wrath of God, and that is a sign of His grace.
During Bonhoeffer's time in Tegel, he gained a deep insight into the persecutions, toadying, and favoritism that emanated from the front office and the kitchen staff in such a place. His experience of the corruption there so haunted him that he wrote a little story with the title, "Farewell, Comrade," in which he described this side of military life. A young, seriously wounded guard cannot maintain himself among his comrades because he does not join in the brutal treatment of the prisoners and the self-enrichment of the guardroom. Every feature of this sketch reveals an exact knowledge and customs of the prison life.
My cell is being cleaned out for me, and while it's being done, I can give the cleaner something to eat. One of them was sentenced to death the other day. It gave me a great shock. One sees a great deal in 7.5 months, particularly with heavy consequences may follow trivial acts of folly. I think a lengthy confinement is demoralizing in every way for most people. I've been thinking out an alternative penal system and the principles of making the punishment fit the crime.
With some of the warders, a relationship of firm trust developed. Many of them tried to arrange the rotation of duties so that they were allotted that section of the corridor where Bonhoeffer's cell was. There were several requests, even from a sergeant major, to be allowed to be photographed with this prisoner in the courtyard. When the sirens howled and the bomber squadron seemed to take their course directly over Tegel, those in the section got as close as possible to Bonhoeffer, who seemed to remain so calm. Such warders found plenty of pretext to take Bonhoeffer to the private section, the sick bay of the prison, even if there was no drill or alarm to make his presence necessary. Here there was a radio so that the air raid warnings could be heard, and Bonhoeffer was able to listen to classical music. In this room he also began to play chess with other prisoners and warders, so that he again, as in his youth, occupied his mind with the theory of chess. At first, Bonhoeffer was pursued even in his dreams by thoughts of those prisoners who were waiting for death to the left and the right of his cell, without him being able to reach them. In time, however, he was able to establish relations with some of those condemned to death, and even more so with prisoners held for interrogation. He then tried to do something for them or bring some pleasure into their lives. For others, he was only able to help them on their last journey through his prayers.
I hear outside a hasty, muffled tread. Near my cell, it suddenly stops dead. I go all cold and hot. Oh, I know what. I go with you, brother, to that place, and I hear your last words face to face. Brother, when I cease to be, pray for me.
Bonhoeffer frequently worked for the betterment of his fellow prisoners. He worked for better protection during air raids and argued that the prisoners' cells should be unlocked during raids. Although Bonhoeffer got along with most people, he withdrew from those who made anti-Semitic remarks. He became friends with several people who could have been lifelong friends and offered prayers for other prisoners.
O merciful God, forgive me all the sins that I have committed, against you and against my fellow man. I trust in your grace, and I commit my life wholly in your hands. When pastors were arrested, I sometimes used to think that it must be easiest for those of them who were unmarried. But I did not know then what the warmth that radiates from the love of a wife and family can mean in the cold air of imprisonment, and how in just such times of separation, the feeling of belonging together through thick and thin actually grows stronger.
However limited life was in the Tegel cell, in retrospect, compared with what people had to undergo elsewhere, it appeared in an almost rosy light. During this period, Bonhoeffer did not have to go hungry, and when after an air raid the cold November air came unhindered through the smashed window of the cell, he did not have to freeze. The influenza, rheumatism, and stomach troubles which came upon him were immediately fought with all the necessary medicines. Bonhoeffer had a lawyer for his trial who visited him, and amid the general danger of life around him, he wrote well-ordered wills. But above all, he had imposed on himself a precise daily routine, and then there was the most important thing for him, his large correspondence.
As I see it, I'm here for some purpose, and I only hope I may fulfill it.
On September 22, 1944, the discovery of documents by the Gestapo made the situation worse for the family. At the beginning of October, the Bonhoeffers gave up a plan of escape. On October 8th, he was transferred to the Reich Head Security Office.
In fear of death, they cried aloud, and, clinging fast to wet ropes straining on the battered deck, they gazed in stricken horror at the sea, that now, unchained in sudden fury, lashed the ship. O gods eternal, excellent, provoked to anger, Help us or give a sign, that we may know who has offended you by secret sin, by breach of oath or heedless blasphemy or murder, who brings us to disaster by misdeeds still hidden, to make a paltry profit for his pride. Thus they bestow, and Jonah said, Behold, I sin before the Lord of hosts, my life is forfeit. Cast me away, my guilt must bear the wrath of God. The righteous shall not perish with the sinner. They trembled, but with hands they knew no weakness. They cast the offender from their midst. The sea stood still.
During his time at the Reich Head Security Office, Bonhoeffer's cell was smaller than his one at Tegel, being barely 5 feet wide by 8 feet long. For breakfast and supper, he was served imitation coffee and 2 slices of bread and jam. At midday, he was served soup. There was a washroom and lavatory at the end of the corridor with a cold water shower. Unlike most prisons, there was no exercise allowed. Although others were tortured, it is almost certain that Bonhoeffer himself never was, though his sufferings were great enough without this. The behavior of the guards, who were now all SS men, towards their one-time high-ranking prisoners, varied from downright sadism to the most formal politeness. Many of them complained about the conditions in general without necessarily being intentionally provocative. It frequently happened that the prisoners had no choice but to humble themselves before some brute in order to avoid being brutally treated. It is said of Bonhoeffer that even under these conditions he was able to command respect from the guards. Without the least embarrassment, he would make modest requests or inquire at the right moment about the personal circumstances or worries of his guards. He never demanded the impossible of them, since he could see that they, too, were in a nervous state.
While all the powers of good aid and attend us, boldly we'll face the future come what may. At eve and at morn, God will befriend us, and oh, most assuredly, on each newborn day.
On February 7, 1945, Bonhoeffer was moved to Buchenwald. The air raid shelters in Buchenwald, which had been promoted to receive prominent prisoners, were damp, cold, and without daylight. They lay beneath houses outside the actual area of the camp, which had been built at one time for camp officials, but after air raids had again been converted into command headquarters and barracks. The cells in the basement were at first intended for SS members who had incurred punishment. In August 1944, the Allies had bombed the buildings outside the camp. As a result, after this, whenever there was an alarm, the sentries went quickly to the trenches some distance away, and the prisoners were locked in until it was over. The food at Buchenwald consisted of a soup at midday and some bread, fat, and marmalade in the evening. According to the instructions of the Reich Security Head Office, the prisoners were to be kept in a condition in which they could be interrogated. According to an eyewitness, Bonhoeffer was all humility and sweetness. He always seemed to diffuse an atmosphere of happiness, of joy in every smallest event in life, and of deep gratitude for the mere fact that he was alive. As Easter Sunday, April 1, 1945, approached, the thunder of American cannons could be heard in the basement. Escape plans were again considered, without practical results.
If you set out to seek freedom, then learn above all things to govern your soul and your senses, for fear that your passions and longing may lead you away from the path you should follow. Chaste be your mind and your body, and both in subjection, obediently, steadfastly, seeking the aim set before them. Only through discipline may a man learn to be free, daring to do what is right, not what fancy may tell you, valiantly grasping occasions, not cravenly doubting. Freedom comes only through deeds, not through thoughts taking wing. Faint not nor fear, but go out to the storm and the action, trusting in God whose commandment you faithfully follow. Freedom exalt will welcome your spirit with joy. A change has come indeed. Your hands so strong and active are bound in helplessness. Now you see your action is end. You sigh in relief, your cause committing to stronger hands. So now you may rest contented. Only for one blissful moment could you draw near to touch freedom. Then, that might be perfect in glory, you give it to God. Come now, thou greatest feast in the journey to freedom eternal. Death, cast aside all the burdensome chain, and demolish the walls of our temporal body. the walls of our souls that are blinded, so that at last we may see that which here remains hidden, freedom, how long we have sought thee in disciplined action and suffering, dying. We now may behold thee revealed in the Lord.
It was apparently in the midday discussion with Hitler on April 5th that decisions were taken which, among other things, ordained that Bonhoeffer was not to survive. In the afternoon of this day, orders were given by the Reich Security Office for the carrying out of the measures of the last days. On April 3rd, 1945, Bonhoeffer was moved to Flossenburg. One of the last people to see him alive, the camp doctor, is recorded as saying, "Through the half-open door in one room of the huts, I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer before taking off his prison garb, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed, so devout and so certain that God heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, and then climbed to the steps of the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I have worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God."